She wasn't supposed to look at me that way, not with that quiet longing in her eyes. And I wasn't supposed to feel my heart race every time she said my name. But some moments don't ask for permission, they just happen. And once they do, nothing feels the same again. I had been in that house 1,000 times before. Birthdays, late-night movies, exam study sessions. Her home had always been just another familiar space in my life. And she had always been my friend's mother, kind, warm, steady, someone I respected, but never really saw beyond that role. But that evening felt different from the very beginning. It was late, close to the blue hush of nightfall, when the streetlights outside soften the world and make everything feel quieter. My friend had stepped out to pick up something he forgot at the store. I offered to wait for him, and she nodded with a tired smile, as though she was grateful for the company. The kitchen light cast a soft, golden glow, and she stood by the sink, rinsing plates from dinner. I don't know what changed. Maybe it was the silence, maybe the way her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands falling gently along her face. She looked softer. Not the composed, always in control host I was used to, there was something unguarded there. A quiet weariness. A kind of grace that comes from years of caring for everyone else first. You don't have to stand there awkwardly, she said lightly, without looking at me. Sit. Talk to me. So I did. We talked about simple things at first, work, schedules, the weather. But slowly, as it tends to happen in the safety of soft lighting and quiet rooms, the conversation slipped into something more real. She told me she missed the days when the house was full of noise, when her son and his friends ran in and out like storms. I told her how strange adulthood felt, how I kept waiting to feel like I had figured things out. She smiled, not the polite kind, but the kind that reaches the eyes, warm and sad and understanding all at once. You don't have to have it all figured out, she said gently. Most of us never really do. I don't know why those words hit me so deeply. Maybe because no one ever said them with such softness before. Maybe because she said them like she had lived them. As she dried her hands, she reached past me to place the towel down. Her hand brushed my forearm, light, unintentional, delicate. But there was warmth in that touch. A warmth that lingered. I felt it long after her hand moved away. She didn't pull back sharply. I didn't pretend not to notice. She simply paused. Just half a second. But in that half second, something invisible shifted. Her eyes met mine. Not searching. Not requesting. Just seeing. For years, she had been a presence in my life. But in that moment, she became a person. A woman with quiet strength, unspoken loneliness, gentle humor, and a softness she rarely let anyone witness. And I realized, with a sudden, steady certainty, that I had never really known her until now. Something had begun. And neither of us could pretend otherwise. The next day, I told myself I was just stopping by to see my friend. That was the logic. Simple. Acceptable. Normal. But when I knocked and she opened the door, it became painfully clear that I hadn't come for my friend at all. She looked surprised at first, just for a breath. Then something gentler softened her expression, as though she was relieved to see me standing there. She stepped aside to let me in, her movements unhurried, graceful in the quiet way she always carried herself. "He's out picking up groceries," she said, and her voice wasn't disappointed. If anything, it held a warmer tone. "But you can stay. If you want." I nodded, and she smiled, small, to herself, like she already knew what my answer would be. The living room was filled with late morning sunlight, soft and golden, filtering through sheer curtains. It made the space feel warm, almost unreal, like we were separated from the rest of the world. She moved to the kitchen and returned with tea, the steam rising in delicate curls. She handed me the cup, and her fingers brushed mine, barely a whisper of touch. But I felt it. And she did too. Because her gaze lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than it needed to. We talked again, just like the night before. But this time the conversation felt different. Not heavy. Not rushed. But thoughtful. Curious. Personal. She asked me about my life, not the usual polite questions, but things that required honesty. What I feared. What I hoped for. What kept me awake at night. And I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone, not because I needed advice, but because she listened in a way that made me feel understood. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to fix anything. She just listened, with that quiet attentiveness that felt grounding. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, the kind of laugh that comes from being genuinely caught off guard. She leaned back slightly, and the afternoon light caught against her profile, illuminating the delicate curve of her jaw, the relaxed softness in her eyes. There was an ease about her, a peace I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I just hadn't looked closely enough. We sat close. Not close enough to be obvious, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her shoulder. The faint scent of jasmine and something like cedar. There were silences between our words, long, unhurried pauses where either of us felt the need to fill the space. We just were. Together. And those silences said more than anything spoken. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. The hallway was quiet still. Our steps slowed, not intentionally, but almost unconsciously, as if either of us wanted the moment to end. As I reached for the doorknob, her hand brushed mine again. This time, either of us pretended it hadn't happened. We simply stood there for a second, breathing in the same slow air, eyes steady, held, searching. The rain had started just before dusk, soft at first, then steady enough to make the world outside blur gently behind the windows. The kind of rain that makes everything slow down. The kind that quiets thoughts and opens room for feelings to rise. I hadn't planned to visit that evening. But something pulled me there anyway, something unspoken, something warm and unnamed. She opened the door before I even knocked twice. Her hair was down this time, falling naturally around her shoulders. She wasn't dressed for guests, just a soft sweater and comfortable pants, the kind of clothes people only wear when they feel safe in their own space. "Oh," she said, a small surprise flickering in her eyes. But then it softened, warming into something like welcome. "You're here. I thought I'd bring something for dinner," I said, lifting the bag in my hand, though we both knew it wasn't really about the food. Her smile was slow. Quiet. "Thank you. Come in." The house felt smaller that evening, not physically, but in the way shared silence makes two people aware of the space between them. She moved into the kitchen, sleeves pushed up just slightly as she began to prepare a meal. I joined her without asking. It felt natural, as if we'd done it 100 times before. We moved around each other in an easy rhythm, stepping aside just enough, but not more than needed. When our hands touched, passing the handle of a knife, brushing flour from a wrist, steadying a cutting board, the touches were small. Light. But they lingered. Not in duration, in meaning. Every brush of her skin sent a quiet warmth through me, subtle but unmistakable. And every time our fingers touched, she paused for just a breath. Not pulling away, simply feeling the moment before letting it go. We sat down to eat at the small kitchen table. The rain outside had become a steady hush, a soft backdrop to the quiet between us. She took a slow sip of tea, eyes drifting thoughtfully. Then, without looking up, she spoke in a voice softer than the rain. "Do you ever feel like your life is happening on the surface? Like you're doing everything right, checking every box, but something inside you feels untouched, unseen, unlived?" Her words settled in the room like warm smoke, gentle and heavy. I nodded slowly. "Yes. More than I'd like to admit." She looked up then. Really looked. And something in her gaze told me she hadn't meant the question as simple conversation. She was speaking about herself. The weight she carries quietly. The loneliness tucked between roles, mother, host, caretaker, steady one. She wasn't asking to be admired. She was asking to be understood. "I think," I said softly, "that sometimes we forget we're allowed to want more." Her breath caught, just barely. Not because of the words. But because I said we. The space between us changed. Not dramatically. Just enough that the air felt warmer. Boundaries were still there. But they were no longer walls. They were doors. And they had quietly begun to open. The house was unusually quiet that night. My friend had gone away for the weekend, a casual trip with coworkers, and the space felt different without his presence. The absence wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, like the difference between a room that's lived in and a room that's simply there. I had told myself I was only stopping by to return something I had borrowed. But once again I knew, and she knew, that wasn't the real reason. She was sitting in the living room when I arrived, a soft lamp glowing beside her, casting the room in warm amber light. Her legs were tucked beneath her on the couch, her hair loosely falling around her shoulders. She looked peaceful, but there was something in her posture, a small heaviness in the way she held her shoulders, that said she had been thinking too much. When she looked up and saw me, the quiet surprise in her eyes eased into something gentle. "You came," she said. I nodded. I wasn't sure if I should. She gave a small exhale of a smile, not happy, not sad, just true. "I'm glad you did." I sat beside her. Not too close at first. There was space between us, visible space, but it didn't feel like distance. The air felt different now, like we were both aware of how carefully we were choosing every movement. For a while, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant patter of cars on wet pavement, the slow rhythm of our breathing, that was the conversation. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet and steady. "You make this house feel less heavy." It wasn't a confession. It was an admission, something she needed to say out loud. I looked at her, not with surprise, but with the kind of honesty that doesn't need words. She turned toward me slightly, her knees angled in my direction. The subtle shift brought us closer, not touching, but undeniably near. She hesitated. And I saw it, the flicker of caution, of responsibility, of all the invisible lines we were already stepping toward. Her hand was resting on the cushion between us. My hand moved, slowly, until my fingers just barely touched hers. Not grabbing. Not holding. Just offering. And she didn't move away. Her breath softened as she let her fingers gently curl between mine, like it was the most natural thing in the world. A touch so slight that it wasn't even a decision, it was a surrender. She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering courage, and when her voice came, it was a whisper. "We need to be careful." She wasn't warning me. She was reassuring herself. "I know," I said. "I don't want to hurt anything. I don't want to rush anything." Her eyes opened. There was something vulnerable in them, something I had never seen before. "I haven't seen like this in a long time," she whispered. And she leaned, not into me, but toward me, a small, instinctive motion of trust. I didn't pull her closer. I didn't force anything to happen. I simply stayed. Present. Steady. There. And in that quiet, in the warm, lamplit stillness of her living room, two hearts learned how to speak without saying a single word. It happened later that night, though either of us had planned for anything serious to unfold. The house had grown quieter as the hours passed, the rain slowly easing outside until there was only silence. A peaceful, thoughtful kind of silence. The kind that makes it impossible to hide from your own heart. We hadn't let go of each other's hands since the living room. Not tightly, not possessively, just a gentle, steady link, like something fragile that needed to be held carefully. At some point, we stood and walked slowly, without speaking, down the hallway. We stopped near her bedroom door. Either of us crossed the threshold. We simply stood there. The moment felt suspended, held in place by everything we felt but had not yet spoken. She leaned lightly against the doorframe, her fingers still threaded loosely with mine. Her eyes were soft, but there was hesitation there too, a quiet fear that came from knowing how much this mattered. "I'm not someone who makes impulsive decisions," she said gently, her voice steady but vulnerable. "I don't let people close. Not really. Not like this." I nodded. I knew. I had seen the carefulness in her. The way she protected her heart by holding everything together for everyone else. I know, I said softly. That's why this means something. Her eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with a kind of emotional exhale. As if someone had finally spoken aloud the truths she had been carrying alone for years. She took one small step closer, not enough to close the space completely, but enough that I could feel her breath, warm and steady, against my chest. Her forehead lowered gently until it rested there, just beneath my collarbone. She didn't speak for a moment. She just breathed. And I placed my hands around her, slowly, carefully, like she was something precious. One hand resting at her back, the other lightly touching her upper arm. Not pulling her in, just being there. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I didn't realize how lonely I'd become. She whispered. Not just being alone, but feeling unseen. Like I was living my life on the outside, watching everyone else move forward while I stayed still. I felt her words, not just heard them. I lowered my head slightly, resting my cheek near her temple, and spoke with the same softness she had offered me. You deserve to be seen. Not just for what you do, but for who you are. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of my shirt, not out of desperation, but out of relief. Like something inside her had finally unclenched. Then she lifted her head just enough to look at me. Her voice barely above a whisper. You're crossing boundaries, and so am I. But she didn't pull away. And I didn't step forward. We stayed exactly where we were, close enough to feel each other's heartbeat, far enough to respect the weight of what was happening. There was no urgency. No rush. No need to name anything. Just two souls quietly admitting the truth, they had found something rare. Something gentle. Something real. The next day unfolded slower than most. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the world washed clean, and the air held the soft scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine from the garden. The sunlight was gentle, not bright, the kind that makes everything feel tender and full of meaning. She suggested we go outside for a walk, not in a casual way, but in the quiet tone of someone who needs fresh air to think. So we stepped into the back garden, where the grass was still cool and damp beneath our shoes. The sky above was a soft gray blue, and the breeze felt like it was carrying unspoken questions between us. We didn't speak at first. We just walked. She wrapped her arms lightly around herself, not from the cold, but in that instinctive way someone does when they're trying to steady their feelings. I walked beside her, hands in my pockets, giving her room to breathe. The silence wasn't tense, just full. Finally, she stopped near the jasmine tree, its white petals brushing lightly in the wind. She turned to me, her expression open but hesitant. We have to think about what this means, she said. Her voice wasn't sharp or distant, it was careful. Not because I regret anything that's happened. I don't. But, she paused, searching for the right words. What we feel, it matters. And because it matters, we can't treat it like something careless. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw just how afraid she was. Not of me. Not of us. But of being hurt. Of losing control. Of falling into something real and not knowing how to protect herself inside it. I've spent years being the strong one, she continued. The dependable one. The one who keeps everything steady. I can't risk something that will break the balance of my life unless I'm sure it's real. I stepped closer, just enough for her to feel that she wasn't speaking into empty space. I'm not asking you for anything rushed, I said softly. I'm not asking you to choose me over your world or your responsibilities. I'm just here. With you. And I'm willing to take this one moment at a time. Slowly. Honestly. Her eyes softened, the fear didn't vanish, but it shifted. Fear became hope. Cautious, trembling hope. She reached out, not quite touching, her fingers hovering near my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it held everything. Hesitation, longing, trust. So I closed the distance, slowly, and took her hand in mine. Not gripping. Not pulling her forward. just holding. Gently. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her shoulders relaxed, her breath steadied, and she let herself lean into that moment. No secrets. No tension. No racing urgency. Just two people choosing tenderness over fear. We didn't define anything that afternoon. We didn't label what we were becoming. Morning arrived gently, the kind of morning where sunlight enters a room softly, like it's knocking rather than bursting in. The house was quiet, filled only with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. It was a new day, but it didn't feel like starting over. It felt like continuing something already in motion, something real, something fragile, something quietly beautiful. She was sitting on the living room couch when I came in, a light blanket around her shoulders, a mug of coffee resting in her hands. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a thoughtful stillness in her expression, like she had spent time with her feelings, turning them over carefully through the night. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes didn't retreat. They didn't hide. They softened. "Good morning," she said, and her voice carried warmth that wasn't just polite, it was personal. I sat beside her, close but not pressing, and the cushion dipped just slightly beneath our shared weight. For a moment, we simply watched the morning light stretch across the floor in soft patterns. The kind of silence that isn't heavy, it just is, quiet and gentle. She took a slow breath, not uncertain, not anxious, but steady. "Ready. I've thought a lot about this," she said. "About us." Her fingers played lightly along the edge of her mug, grounding her thoughts. "This isn't something I want to hide. And it's not something I want to rush either." I listened. Not to respond, just to hear her fully. "I know there are things we'll have to navigate," she continued. "People's assumptions. The past. The future. But," she paused, and her eyes found mine, steady, honest. "I don't want fear to be the reason I walk away from something meaningful." Her words didn't strike like a confession. They landed like truth, the kind that sits deep in the chest. I felt my chest loosen, my breath deepen, like something inside me had been quietly waiting to hear those words spoken aloud. "I'm here," I said. "Not for something temporary. Not for something confusing or secret. I'm here because being close to you feels right." Her hand moved then, slow, thoughtful, resting gently on my cheek. The warmth of her palm was grounding, familiar, and new all at once. She leaned in, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gently, and kissed me. Not on the lips, but on the cheek. A kiss that lingered. A kiss that said, "This is real. This is chosen. This is ours." When she leaned back, her eyes didn't dart away. They held mine, open, sure, soft. "Then we go slow," she whispered. "We communicate. We protect this. We protect each other." I nodded. And I took her hand, not as a secret, not as a question, but as a quiet promise. There was no rush. No frantic need. No dramatic declarations. Just two hearts choosing tenderness over fear. Connection over caution. Understanding over assumption. A beginning, soft, steady, and undeniably real.